The Lord came to Moses, and he said, Moses, I have good news and bad news. Moses said, Lord, please give me the good news. And the Lord said, Moses, I'm going to empower you to part the waters of the Red Sea and allow my people to escape. And after they do, the sea is going to come back and engulf the armies of the Pharaoh. Moses says, Lord, that's wonderful news. But what's the bad news? God said, you have to prepare the environmental impact statement. That sort of captures it, doesn't it? I want you to ask yourselves a question. Think of a major infrastructure project upon which your region, your city, your state depends. The New Jersey Turnpike, the tunnels into New York, the Croton Reservoir, the Quabbin Reservoir in Massachusetts, the gigantic energy transmission grid, the interstate highway system. Ask yourself, could those projects be built today? I think in many cases the answer is no. And if that's the case, what it means is that the infrastructure of this country is essentially a snapshot circa 1962 or 1955, or pick a date. But if that's true, then we're in real trouble, because the country continues to grow. The demands of the public for electricity, for transportation resources, for airports, for rail lines, for roads, doesn't stop. It increases because the population, I don't know what the population was in 1962. I suspect it was 180 million, or maybe something in that neighborhood, 200 million. Now it's 330 million and continuing to grow. So if the answer to the question, and seriously, it's a kind of fun thought exercise. Could we build the New Jersey Turnpike today? And if the answer to that is no, it's a hell of a problem. It is a very, very serious problem. And it's serious on a number of levels, it seems to me. One is it's serious because of the costs involved. If you can't do it at all, by the way, that's a huge cost to society. But even if you can do it, at what cost? I'm familiar with biggest infrastructure project in recent years in Maine is something called the Maine Power Reliability Project, which was an upgrade of the existing transmission grid in Maine, undertaken by Central Maine Power. I'm somewhat aware of that project because it's a $1.5 billion project. It will be finished in probably about 2 years. But in just some of the data on that project in terms of getting it done, it was 4 years from the first meeting to the first spade of earth being moved, and $200 million. Now, $200 million is about, there are a little over 1 million people in Maine, 1.3 million people. So $200 per person for everybody in Maine just for the permitting. That has nothing to do with building the project. And it involved federal agencies, state agencies, and 70 towns. In one town, I understand there were 30 public meetings. And this was a project where all they were doing was upgrading the wires in the existing right-of-way. No new right-of-way. I mean, I think maybe it was 4%, 96 point something percent of the project was within the existing right-of-way. And if they had to do this project from scratch to build it, getting the right-of-way, forget it. Now, the problem, it's a problem on the surface of that the cost, the time, the cost to society. But the real problem is hidden because it's the projects that never happen because of these barriers. It's the opportunity cost. It's the project where people sit around a table and say, to hell with it. This is just too much trouble. It's too much expense. We'll never make it. It's a kind of regulatory exhaustion in advance phenomenon. And that's a loss to society. It's hard to measure. It's impossible to measure, because how do you measure something that doesn't happen? But it is a very, very serious problem. Now, I should have started, the Moses story was too good to not begin with. But I ought to give you a little bit of background of me. I have a kind of unusual biography in the sense of a variety. Somebody introduced me at a dinner recently and listed the things I'd done, and I realized in listening to it the only conclusion was this guy can't hold a job. I am trained as a lawyer, graduated at the University of Virginia Law School, worked for the Public Legal Services Program, and that's how I happened to go to Maine. I'm the second person from away ever elected governor of Maine. From away means anywhere in the U.S. other than Maine. That's a kind of generic term. My epitaph will be, he did all right for a boy from away. That'll be kind of the way it goes. I practice law. I've been in business. I've been in the energy field off and on for about the past 30 years. I've done hydro development, biomass development, large-scale energy conservation projects, and wind development. I've been a governor. I've also been a lobbyist for the environmental community. In the 70s, I was the lobbyist in the Maine legislature for a coalition of all of our major environmental organizations. And in fact, I can say with great pride, and you'll see in a moment why I can do this, that I drafted Maine's billboard law, which took all the billboards off the highways in Maine. The reason I can say that, because I usually don't like to boast, is that the drafting consisted of myself and a junior attorney general sitting in a room taking Vermont's billboard law, and everywhere it said Vermont, we crossed it out and wrote Maine. So that's what that was my great draftsmanship. But I worked on the bottle bill in Maine. We have returnables and subdivision rules. And in fact, ironically, I don't know if I've ever mentioned this to the president of Central Maine Power, one of the bills I worked on for the environmental community was a bill that required Department of Environmental Protection review of transmission projects, which 30 years later became a major thorn in the side of Central Maine Power. And the other story I was going to tell from my own experience was having developed a major wind project, a 50 megawatt, $120 million wind project in western Maine. That project was this was a private, private development. Just the permitting was 4 years and cost $5 million, and that's $5 million totally no subsidies, as I call them, high-test dollars that were totally at risk. And if we had lost one vote in the town or at the DEP or anywhere along the multiple permitting lines that we had to undertake, all of that money would have been gone. It was high-risk money. And the question I've asked myself and my partners is, if we'd known what we were getting into, would we have done it again? Would we have undertaken that risk and the time? And of course, if I'd known I was going to run for the U.S. Senate and all I'd see were ads with windmills saying what a monster I was for destroying the mountains, that's another kind of, that's a political risk, I suppose. I had no idea at the time this was even remotely possible. But the point I'm making is, if people self-regulate, if people stop doing things because of regulatory barriers, then we're in trouble as a society. We're going to lose a lot of the dynamism that this society depends upon and has made us who we are, and particularly in the area of infrastructure. It's all about balance. Nobody that I know advocates repealing NEPA or the wetlands laws or public involvement in these kinds of issues. The question is finding the right balance where you can get things done at a reasonable price in a reasonable time and not trample on the legitimate interests and rights of people who are going to be impacted by it. And I hate making speeches and not having solutions, but I don't really have a clear solution to that, except that we need to weigh those two things. And we need to think about, and I think a helpful way to approach this is to take case studies like the Maine Reliability Project and say, okay, why did it cost so much? Where were the bottlenecks? Where were the additional costs? Why did it take so long? Are there ways to one-stop shopping, for example? I'm a big advocate of that, where you get all your decisions in one time rather than seriatim, as we used to say in law school. And by the way, this may be a historic day. This may be the day, you should mark your calendars, this may be the day that the United States government seriously stopped functioning. Because when I go back up, the Senate is in total disarray. We're in the middle of trying to pass the National Defense Authorization Act, which is one of the few bills that generally has bipartisan support. It goes through every year. It's one of the few things that passes every year, and it was stopped dead yesterday by a few people objecting and demanding amendments that aren't relevant. And the whole thing is, I talked to a fellow that works in the majority office last night. He said it's the worst he's ever seen it in his life. There may be a vote on a procedural change involving the confirmation of judges. I raise all this because it's a similar problem where process is essentially making the functioning of the institution, whether it's the building of a highway or the writing of our laws, impossible. And you'll see headlines, I hope not, I really hope not, but you may see headlines tonight that says Senate goes home in total gridlock or total deadlock. And I've worked very hard. I'm on the budget committee and trying to work on this budget resolution. I've worked very hard to try to put bipartisan groups. I've met with 2 bipartisan groups in the last 48 hours on that. Can't get anywhere. Nobody wants to give. Nobody wants to compromise. And we really are, I believe, and I don't want to over-dramatize it, but I think we're at a testing place as to whether or not the system that was bequeathed to us by the framers can function. Interesting, though, and I don't want to go too far off on this subject, interestingly, many of the so-called, what you call regulatory problems or the process problems are not constitutionally based. The rules that we're fighting about the filibuster and those things are nowhere in the Constitution. In fact, there's we're fighting about the required number of votes to confirm judges and cabinet appointments. And of course, the practice has become, because of the filibuster, you need 60 votes. Well, interestingly, the provision in the Constitution that talks about advice and consent, the very sentence says, the Senate shall provide advice and consent on treaties with 2/3 of its members. Semicolon or comma, I can't remember, and shall provide advice and consent on presidential nominations for executive positions and the judiciary. There's no 2/3. You see, the framers knew fractions. And they said it in one place and they didn't say it in the other. But we have imported into the rules of the body, not from the Constitution, but just from practice, these rules that are now proving to be so difficult. So let me get back to the regulatory question. And again, I hate to raise problems, but a friend of mine wrote an essay in a Maine newspaper about 4 or 5 years ago, and he said one of the problems with the regulatory process is it has come to the point where there can be no losers. Everyone has to be happy. Every neighbor, every town, every person along the right-of-way, because the process is so easy to slow down, to read. And again, ask yourself, if everyone had to be happy, could you have built the New Jersey Turnpike? Because there was some farmer along the way that didn't want to sell his land or didn't want to divide his property in half by this big highway. And somehow we have to find a way to balance the legitimate interests of the community with the interest in the developing of the infrastructure. And I think most of you are here today because you believe, as I do, that the balance has been tipped too far in the direction of impedance, and it's going to be a real problem in how we proceed and how we survive and prosper as a nation. One of the things I really regret about my current job is that I have to come to things like this and then have to go back, because I'd really like to be with you all day. I particularly am interested in hearing from the speaker from the OECD, because I think there are places in the world that have figured this out, that provide the kind of environmental and other protections without the burden and cost that is really making many important developments virtually impossible. And when I ran for governor, I used to say I was the first candidate for governor of Maine who had ever applied to the DEP for a permit. And that was true. And I had hands-on experience in permitting hydro plants and biomass plants and those kinds of things. And I used to say what I want in Maine is the toughest environmental standards in the country and the most user-friendly environmental process in the country. That's what we ought to be seeking, not bending the standards, lowering the standards, but making the process timely and predictable. That should be the goal, it seems to me, and it is an achievable goal. And I just think it's if we don't figure this out, it is going to be at a great cost to our society, particularly when we reach a moment in our history where our infrastructure desperately needs rebuilding, whether it's rail lines, airports. I mean, imagine building LaGuardia today. Just think of building LaGuardia. I mean, it would be completely impossible, and the airport would end up being in somewhere in the Hudson Valley. No, you couldn't do that. I'm not sure where it would be, but I think we all understand the point. That's why you're here. But this is critically important. This isn't an academic exercise. And the challenge is, how do we protect the legitimate interests of the public and the environment without at the same time creating a situation where we simply can't build anything? And that's going to be a great loss to our society. So I will end there. I don't have a big ending. Oh, I do want to commend to you all a book. This should be required reading for this course. It's a book that was written in the 70s here in Washington by a lawyer named Robert Karash, who I knew slightly, and it's called The Institutional Imperative, or How to Understand the United States Government and Other Bulky Objects. It's hilarious and brilliant. It is the single best analysis of how and why institutions do what they do, particularly regulatory institutions, that I've ever encountered. It's out of print. You can get it on a Libris. I've got 3 or 4 copies. I recently bought one and gave it to Chuck Hagel when he took over the Pentagon, because that's a bulky object if ever there was one. But this book really talks about this whole issue of how a regulatory process, and this was written in the 70s, can go awry. It's called The Institutional Imperative. Karash, K-H-A-R-A-S-C-H. He was a regulatory lawyer here in Washington. It's an absolutely brilliant book. It's written like a geometry text. It has theorems, laws, and corollaries. For example, the iron law of the security office. The iron law of the security office is, if you create a security office, threats to security will be found. And that gives you a flavor of this, of the way he thinks. It really is. It's funny, but very insightful, and it's guided my thinking on these issues for now going on 35 years. So Godspeed, because this is important work. And I think, again, if we can find a way to achieve the balance and realize that everyone can't be made happy, and that we have to have a process that works, that's timely and predictable. That's really the goal, and I commend you for coming together to try to tackle this important problem. Thanks very much. Great to be with you.